I opened my dream home on a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of morning that feels like a promise. Sunlight spilled through wide glass windows, touching walls I had saved for, dreamed of, and built brick by brick with years of sacrifice. This house wasn't just concrete and paint, it was proof that a man who lost everything once could still rise again. I stood there alone for a moment, hand on the doorframe, whispering a thank you to myself for not giving up. That afternoon, I invited my son and my daughter-in-law. I wanted to share my happiness, nothing more. I imagined laughter in the living room, tea on the balcony, maybe even pride in my son's eyes. I told myself that family is family, no matter how distant they had become. I believed, foolishly, that success might bring us closer. They arrived late. From the moment they stepped inside, the air changed. My son walked around with a tight smile, opening cabinets, tapping walls, asking about prices with a tone that felt more like an audit than curiosity. My daughter-in-law didn't even bother to hide her disgust. She ran her fingers along the furniture and scoffed, complaining about colors, space, and cheap choices, even though everything here cost more than they earned in years. Then the questions turned sharp. "So whose name is on the papers?" she asked. "Mine," I said calmly. "I built this." My son laughed, a short, ugly laugh I didn't recognize. He said it wasn't fair, that as his father I should have thought of him first, that this house should be theirs, that I was selfish for enjoying life alone at my age. Words piled on words, each one heavier than the last, until the pride I felt that morning began to crack. I refused. That's when everything broke. My daughter-in-law shoved a chair so hard it slammed into the glass table, shattering it. My son ripped a painting off the wall, the one I bought to celebrate my first year of peace, and threw it across the room. They screamed, accused, cursed. She kicked over plants. He punched a hole straight through the drywall. They weren't angry children anymore. They were strangers fueled by greed and entitlement. I stood there, frozen, watching the destruction of something I loved, not by enemies, but by my own blood. When it was over, they stormed out, leaving broken glass, torn curtains, and silence behind. No apology, no shame, just the echo of their footsteps in a house that felt violated. That night I didn't cry. I cleaned. I picked up every shard of glass, patched every hole, repainted every wall. With each repair, something inside me hardened, not into bitterness, but clarity. I realized that love given to the wrong people becomes permission to be abused. And I promised myself never again. 3 months passed. During those months, I rebuilt more than my home. I changed my will. I transferred assets. I put everything under trusts and legal protections they would never touch. I stopped answering calls. I blocked numbers. I lived quietly, peacefully, and for the first time in years, without fear of disappointing anyone. Then one evening, there was a knock at my door. I already knew who it was. They stood there smaller somehow. My son's shoulders slumped. My daughter-in-law's eyes were swollen, her voice shaking. Life had turned its back on them. Debts, failed business deals, friends who disappeared when money did. They spoke fast, tripping over apologies that felt rehearsed. They said they had lost their way. They said families should forgive. They said they needed help. They begged. I listened without interrupting, without anger. When they finished, I invited them inside. They froze when they saw the house. It was more beautiful than before. Calmer. Stronger. Every detail intentional. No trace of the chaos they left behind, except in their faces. They looked around, realizing not just what they had destroyed, but what they had lost. I poured tea and sat across from them. Then I told them the truth. I told them I had forgiven them the moment I decided they no longer had power over me. But forgiveness, I explained, does not mean access. It does not mean trust. And it certainly does not mean reward. I showed them copies of the legal documents. I explained that nothing I owned could ever be claimed by them, that I had chosen peace over blood ties poisoned by greed, that I would help them emotionally if they truly changed, but financially, materially, they would receive nothing. My son cried. My daughter-in-law went silent. I stood up, opened the door, and wished them well. As they walked away, I didn't feel victory the way revenge stories describe it. I felt something better, freedom. My dream home stood behind me unshaken. And for the first time, I understood that the strongest revenge isn't destruction or humiliation. It's building a life so solid that the people who tried to break you can never touch it again. For most of my life, dreams came second to survival. Every decision I made was about responsibility, feeding my family, paying debts, enduring jobs that drained me, but kept the lights on. There were years when I forgot what it felt like to want something purely for myself. I watched other people talk about dream homes, like they were natural milestones, while for me, even the idea felt selfish. A roof that didn't leak and walls that didn't crack were luxuries I learned not to expect. Yet somewhere deep inside, a quiet promise lived on. One day, when the noise of obligation faded, I would build something that belonged only to me. That promise became my anchor during the hardest years. When my marriage failed and the house we lived in was sold to cover losses, I was left with little more than a suitcase and a bruised sense of dignity. Friends assumed I would move in with my son, depend on him, shrink myself into the background of his life. I smiled and nodded, but inside I knew I couldn't survive another chapter defined by dependence. I took whatever work I could find, sometimes beneath my experience, sometimes physically exhausting, but always honest. I saved slowly, painfully, watching small amounts grow while denying myself comfort after comfort. Every coin I set aside felt like a brick laid for a future no one else could take away. As the years passed, the dream sharpened. I didn't want a mansion or a house meant to impress others. I wanted light, big windows that reminded me mornings still existed. I wanted silence, rooms where no one argued, demanded, or judged. I wanted space that reflected who I had become after loss, simpler, calmer, stronger. When I finally bought the land, I stood there alone on bare ground, feeling ridiculous for tearing up over dirt and weeds. But that patch of earth represented something rare in my life control. For the first time, the future wasn't something happening to me. It was something I was shaping. Building the house tested me in ways I hadn't expected. Contractors tried to overcharge. Timelines stretched and unexpected costs appeared like ambushes. There were moments I considered stopping, settling for something smaller or unfinished, but each setback reminded me why I started. This home wasn't about comfort alone, it was about reclaiming self-respect. I chose every detail carefully, the placement of windows, the color of the walls, the texture of the floors, not to show taste, but to leave a quiet signature of myself in every corner. When the last worker left and the door closed behind him, the silence felt sacred. The first morning inside the finished house remains etched in me. Sunlight poured in exactly as I had imagined years earlier, touching surfaces I had once only pictured in my mind. I brewed tea in a kitchen built to my height, my habits, my life. No compromises, no explanations. I walked from room to room slowly, almost afraid that moving too fast might break the spell. Each step confirmed a truth I had long doubted I was capable. I hadn't failed at life. I had simply taken the long road. This home stood as evidence of endurance. It carried the weight of every humiliation swallowed, every night of exhaustion, every time I chose patience over bitterness. It wasn't just shelter. It was a declaration that I still mattered, even when others had stopped seeing me that way. Opening its doors felt like opening a chapter I had earned, not been given. And in that moment, before anyone else entered, I understood that the real victory wasn't the house itself. It was the man who stood inside it, still standing, still dreaming, and finally at peace with the life he had fought to rebuild. When the house was finally ready, my first instinct wasn't to protect it or keep it to myself. It was to share it. After everything I had endured, I still believed that happiness multiplied when it was witnessed by family. The distance between my son and me had grown quietly over the years, not through dramatic fights but through missed calls, postponed visits, and conversations that felt more like obligations than connections. I told myself this was normal, that adult children get busy, that love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Inviting him and his wife into my new home felt like extending an olive branch, a chance to remind ourselves that we were still family beneath the silence. I spent the entire morning preparing. Not because they expected anything extravagant, but because I wanted the house to feel warm, welcoming, alive. I cooked food I knew my son loved as a child, hoping nostalgia might soften whatever invisible wall stood between us. I cleaned surfaces that were already spotless, straightened cushions no one had sat on yet, and opened the windows to let fresh air carry the scent of new beginnings through the rooms. I imagined his reaction, a smile of pride, maybe even surprise. In my mind, he would walk through the house and say, "I'm proud of you, Dad." That single sentence, I realized, mattered more to me than any praise from strangers. They arrived later than planned, without apology. From the moment the door opened, something felt off. My son stepped inside with a polite but distant expression, the kind people wear at formal gatherings. His wife's eyes moved quickly, scanning the space not with curiosity but calculation. They didn't comment on the warmth of the light or the calm of the rooms. Instead, they began opening doors, tapping walls, lifting cushions, asking questions that felt strangely transactional. How much did this cost? Who helped you pay? How much is it worth now? Each question landed like a small stone, unsettling but not yet painful enough to protest. I laughed nervously at first, trying to keep the mood light. I told them stories about the building process, about delays and small victories, hoping to steer the visit towards something human. But their attention never stayed on the story. It always drifted back to numbers. My daughter-in-law frowned at the furniture, muttering that it was basic for the area. She commented that the house was too large for just one person, her tone carrying an implication she didn't bother to hide. My son didn't correct her. He nodded along, his silence louder than any agreement spoken aloud. Slowly, the purpose of their visit revealed itself. This wasn't about celebrating my achievement. It was an evaluation, an assessment of what could be taken, not what could be shared. When my daughter-in-law asked whose name was on the ownership papers, the room seemed to tighten around us. I answered simply, calmly, unaware that honesty would be mistaken for provocation. Her expression changed instantly, disappointment turning sharp as if I had violated an unspoken rule. My son's jaw tightened, and for the first time that day, he looked directly at me, not with affection, but with resentment. He said I should have thought of him first. That as a father, my responsibility didn't end just because he was grown. He spoke about fairness, about inheritance, about how difficult life had become for them, as if my success had somehow caused their struggles. The words cut deeply because they reframed my years of sacrifice as selfishness. Everything I had endured to stand on my own feet was suddenly presented as a betrayal of him. I realized then that they hadn't come to congratulate me. They had come to claim. Still, I tried to reason. I explained that this house represented independence, not rejection, that I was proud of him and wished him well, but this was something I had built alone, late in life, for peace. My explanation only hardened their expressions. To them, boundaries sounded like insults. Love, in their eyes, was measured by what I was willing to give up, not what I had already given for decades. In that moment, hope drained quietly from the room. I saw clearly that inviting them had not brought us closer. It had exposed a truth I wasn't ready to face. That sometimes the people you share your joy with don't want to celebrate it. They want to own it. The refusal left the air thick and unmoving, as if the house itself were holding its breath. I had expected disappointment, maybe even anger, but not what followed. My words hadn't been loud or cruel. They were steady, deliberate, spoken by a man who finally understood where his limits lay. Yet to them, my refusal sounded like defiance. My daughter-in-law's face hardened first, her lips pressing into a thin line that trembled with restrained fury. My son looked at her, then back at me, and in that glance I saw something frighteningly unfamiliar. Permission. It started small, almost absurdly so. A sharp laugh from her, mocking the idea that this place was truly mine. A comment about how lonely it must be to sit in such a big house with no one to care for you. Words meant to bruise rather than argue. I tried to respond calmly, reminding them that this was not a discussion to be won, but a boundary to be respected. My tone only seemed to fuel them further. Respect, after all, sounds like arrogance to those who feel entitled. She stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back so hard it scraped loudly across the floor. The sound echoed through the room, jarring and ugly against the calm I had worked so hard to build. My son followed her lead, pacing like a caged animal, muttering about sacrifice and ingratitude. Then the first thing broke, a decorative glass bowl knocked off the table by her careless swipe. It shattered instantly, pieces scattering like startled birds across the tiles. I flinched, not from fear, but from disbelief. This was happening in my home, at the hands of the people I had invited with hope. I asked them to stop. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten or beg, I simply asked. That, somehow, was the spark. My son's restraint snapped completely. He grabbed the framed artwork I had chosen with such care, the one that marked the end of a difficult year, and hurled it across the room. It struck the wall with a dull crack, glass exploding outward. My daughter-in-law kicked over a plant, soil spilling like a wound across the floor, then shoved a side table hard enough for it to crash onto its side. The destruction wasn't random, it was intentional. Each object they chose felt symbolic, as if they were erasing my joy piece by piece. The couch cushions were ripped open. Curtains were yanked from their hooks. My son punched the drywall in a fit of rage, leaving a jagged hole where smooth paint had been just hours earlier. Their faces were contorted with something beyond anger, resentment fermented over years, now unleashed without restraint. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching the home I had built with patience be torn apart in minutes. What hurt most wasn't the broken furniture or damaged walls. It was the realization that they felt justified. In their minds, this destruction was not violence, it was punishment. Punishment for daring to say no. Punishment for choosing myself after a lifetime of choosing others. I saw clearly then that had I handed them the keys, it would never have been enough. There would always have been something else to take, another line to cross. At some point, the shouting turned into exhausted silence. Breathing heavy, movements slowing. They seemed to realize there was nothing left to break that would give them satisfaction. My daughter-in-law smoothed her hair as if straightening herself after a minor inconvenience. My son avoided my eyes entirely. Neither apologized. Neither looked ashamed. They gathered their coats and walked toward the door, stepping over debris without a backward glance. The door slammed behind them with a finality that rang through every damaged room. I didn't move right away. I listened to the quiet settle, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock and the distant hum of the city outside. The house looked wounded, but still standing, and so was I. In that stillness, something inside me shifted. The shock gave way to clarity. Whatever illusions I had carried about unconditional loyalty dissolved among the shards of glass on the floor. Family, I understood now, is not defined by blood alone, but by respect. And respect cannot survive where entitlement rules. I knelt and picked up the first piece of broken glass, careful not to cut myself. As I placed it in the trash, I felt a strange calm take hold. They had shown me exactly who they were, and in doing so, they had freed me from the guilt of hoping they would be something else. The house could be repaired, walls could be patched, furniture replaced. What they destroyed that day wasn't my future, it was their access to it. The morning after they left, I woke up expecting to feel anger, maybe even regret. Instead, there was a heavy stillness, the kind that follows a storm, when the sky hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. I walked through the house slowly, taking in the damage in daylight. Broken glass glittered on the floor like a cruel decoration. The hole in the wall looked larger now, more deliberate. Plants lay uprooted, their soil scattered, roots exposed to the air. It would have been easy to collapse under the weight of it all, to let the destruction confirm every fear I'd ever had about trusting people. But something unexpected happened. I felt steady. I didn't call anyone to complain. I didn't tell relatives or neighbors what had happened. I didn't want sympathy and I didn't want advice. What I wanted was control, quiet, methodical, unquestionable control over my life. I started cleaning. Not in a frantic way, but carefully, almost ceremonially. Each piece of glass went into the trash with intention. Each broken object was removed without drama. As the mess disappeared, so did the chaos they had brought with them. The house began to breathe again, and so did I. Once the physical damage was handled, my focus shifted to something deeper. I realized that the destruction hadn't started that day. It had only revealed a problem that had existed for years. My generosity, my silence, my habit of smoothing things over had created expectations I never agreed to. Saying no had exposed how fragile their version of family truly was. That knowledge was painful, but it was also empowering. Pain tells you where the wound is. Clarity tells you how to heal it. I began rebuilding, but this time with purpose beyond repair. The walls were patched stronger than before. I chose sturdier fixtures, reinforced shelves, better locks. Every improvement felt symbolic, as if I were fortifying not just the house but myself. While the workers did their part, I did mine. I sat with a lawyer and spoke plainly, without embarrassment or hesitation. I reviewed documents I had once avoided because they felt uncomfortable, too final. Ownership papers, wills, trusts, boundaries put into ink instead of hope. I learned that protecting yourself isn't an act of selfishness, it's an act of responsibility. I restructured everything so that no one could claim confusion later. No assumptions. No loopholes. I didn't do this out of spite. I did it out of respect for the life I had worked so hard to rebuild. Each signature I placed on those documents felt like closing a door, not in anger, but in peace. Emotionally, I changed as well. I stopped replaying the scene in my head, stopped imagining what I should have said differently. There was no perfect sentence that would have turned entitlement into gratitude. I accepted that truth and let go of the need to be understood by people who had never tried to understand me. I limited contact. I stopped explaining myself. Silence, I discovered, can be incredibly powerful when it's chosen rather than forced. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The house transformed again, this time into something even better than it was before. Not more expensive, not more impressive, just more intentional. It reflected who I was now, someone who valued peace over approval, stability over validation. Friends who visited noticed the change. They said the house felt calm, grounded. I smiled and agreed, knowing that the calm didn't come from design choices alone. It came from boundaries finally honored. During those months, I slept better than I had in years. I woke up without dread, without that low-level anxiety that comes from waiting for the next demand, the next guilt-laced request. I cooked for myself, read in the evenings, sat by the window with tea and watched the world move, without feeling the need to chase or justify my place in it. The house wasn't lonely. It was quiet in a way that felt earned. I didn't reach out to my son or his wife, and they didn't reach out to me either. That silence told me more than any argument ever could. It confirmed that my value to them had always been conditional. And for the first time, I was okay with that truth. I wasn't responsible for fixing what I didn't break. I wasn't obligated to keep doors open to people who had proven they would kick them down. By the end of the third month, the house stood complete again, stronger, calmer, fully mine. But the real reconstruction had happened inside me. I no longer measured love by sacrifice alone. I no longer believed that endurance was the same as loyalty. I had rebuilt my home, yes, but more importantly, I had rebuilt my sense of worth. And that was something no one could ever tear down again. Expend 5 key point in 800 words without any heating. The knock came on a quiet evening, the kind that usually signals nothing more than a neighbor or a delivery. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. Peace had become precious to me, and I had learned not to interrupt it without good reason. But something about the sound, hesitant, uneven, pulled me from my chair. As I approached the door, I already knew who it was. Some instincts sharpen with age, and this one felt certain. When I opened the door, the sight confirmed it. My son stood there, shoulders slumped, eyes hollowed by exhaustion, and something close to fear. My daughter-in-law stood slightly behind him, her usual confidence replaced by tightness around the mouth and eyes that refused to meet mine. They looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in presence. The arrogance that once filled a room before they even spoke was gone, replaced by uncertainty. Time, it seemed, had not been kind to them. They spoke quickly, almost tripping over each other. Life had become difficult. Plans had fallen apart. People they trusted had disappeared when money ran out. There were debts, pressure, sleepless nights. Each sentence carried an unspoken expectation, as if hardship itself entitled them to forgiveness and support. My daughter-in-law's voice cracked as she spoke about stress and regret, careful to frame the past as a misunderstanding rather than a choice. My son apologized, but his words felt heavy, practiced, like lines repeated many times in his head before daring to say them aloud. I listened without interrupting. Not because I owed them patience, but because I wanted to understand. There is a difference between hearing and absorbing, and I did both. I watched their hands tremble, their eyes flicker toward the house behind me, measuring, hoping. It became clear that they hadn't come only for reconciliation. They had come because the world had taught them a lesson they hadn't learned at my table. Need had brought them back, not reflection alone. I stepped aside and invited them in. The house greeted them with quiet dignity. It was whole again, stronger than before, with no visible trace of the chaos they had left behind. They paused just inside the door, their expressions shifting as they took it in. The space felt different now, calmer, more deliberate. They looked around slowly, as if expecting to see evidence of their destruction, some sign that their anger had left permanent scars. Instead, they saw a home that had not only healed but evolved. We sat at the table, and I poured tea the way I always did, steady and unhurried. The ritual grounded me. They watched every movement, perhaps realizing that the man in front of them was not the same one they had stormed out on months earlier. When the silence stretched long enough, I spoke. I told them I was sorry they were struggling. I told them I never wished hardship on them, not even after what they had done. Those words surprised them. Compassion, when given without conditions, can be disarming. Then I spoke the truth they hadn't prepared for. I told them that forgiveness and access were not the same thing, that I had forgiven them the moment I chose not to live in anger. But forgiveness did not undo consequences. It did not restore trust automatically, and it did not grant rights to things they had tried to take by force. I explained that during the months of silence, I had secured my life legally and emotionally. Everything I owned was protected. There would be no confusion, no expectations, no future arguments dressed up as family discussions. My son's face crumpled as he realized what that meant. Tears came then, unfiltered and raw. My daughter-in-law stared at the table, her hands clenched, her voice gone. They begged, not loudly, not violently, but desperately. They spoke about second chances, about blood, about how families should stand together when the world turns cold. I listened, feeling the weight of their words, but not their pull. I stood and walked them to the door. I told them I hoped they would rebuild their lives the way I had rebuilt mine. Slowly, honestly, without shortcuts taken from someone else's sacrifice. I told them I would always wish them well, but I would no longer rescue them from the consequences of their choices. When they left, there was no shouting, no slammed door, just the sound of footsteps fading into the night. As I closed the door behind them, I felt neither triumph nor sorrow. I felt certainty, the kind that settles deep in your bones and doesn't shake. They had come back humbled, but humility alone doesn't heal what entitlement breaks. I returned to my chair, to my quiet, to the life I had fought to protect. And in that stillness, I understood that sometimes the most powerful moment in a story isn't when people beg to return. It's when you finally know you don't need them to. After the door closed behind them, I didn't rush back to my chair or distract myself with noise. I stood there for a long moment, hand resting on the doorframe, listening to the quiet settle again. It wasn't the silence of emptiness or loneliness. It was the silence of resolution, the kind that follows a long internal argument when you finally know which side you're on. I realized then that what I felt wasn't revenge in the way stories usually describe it. There was no thrill, no satisfaction in watching them walk away defeated. What I felt was something steadier and far more powerful: freedom. For years, I had been conditioned to believe that love meant sacrifice without limits. That being a good father meant enduring disrespect, swallowing pain, and always leaving the door open, no matter how many times it was kicked in. That belief had shaped my choices quietly, dangerously, turning patience into permission. Letting go of it felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd worn in every season of my life. I wasn't cold without it. I was lighter. Forgiveness, I learned, is often misunderstood. People think it's a gift you give to others, a way of saying what happened doesn't matter anymore. But true forgiveness is something you do for yourself. It doesn't erase memory or excuse behavior. It simply releases you from carrying poison in your chest. I had forgiven them long before they returned, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Holding on to anger would have tied me to them longer than any argument ever could. Boundaries were the real victory. Quiet, firm, unbreakable boundaries. They didn't need to be announced with anger or defended with explanations. They existed because I had decided they would. For the first time, my sense of self wasn't up for negotiation. I didn't need to justify why I wanted my own home, my own space, my own life. Wanting peace was reason enough, and protecting it was not cruelty, it was wisdom. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I no longer flinched when my phone rang. I didn't feel a knot in my stomach when I thought about family gatherings or future conversations. There was no constant background noise of guilt whispering that I owed more, that I hadn't done enough. That voice had lost its power. In its place was a calm confidence, rooted in the knowledge that I had acted with integrity, even when it was difficult. The house felt different too, though nothing physical had changed. It felt grounded, as if it recognized the shift. Mornings were slow and intentional. I took my time with coffee, watched light move across the walls, listened to the city wake up without feeling the need to keep up. Evenings were gentle. I read, I cooked, I rested. The home was no longer just a symbol of survival. It was a living space that mirrored my inner state, stable, uncluttered, mine. I thought often about the idea of revenge, how it's usually portrayed as dominance over someone else. But dominance is exhausting. It keeps you focused on the people who hurt you, measuring your life against their downfall. That kind of revenge still gives them power. What I had discovered was something entirely different. The most devastating thing you can do to someone who tried to control or exploit you is to become unreachable, to build a life so full and so well protected that their opinions, demands, and regrets no longer matter. I didn't celebrate their failure, and I didn't take pleasure in their struggle. Their journey was theirs to face, just as mine had been. What mattered was that I no longer felt responsible for fixing the consequences of choices I didn't make. Compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. Boundaries without compassion are bitterness. I had finally learned to hold both at the same time. If they ever changed, truly changed, I would acknowledge it with kindness. But kindness would not come at the cost of my well-being again. Love, I understood now, is not proven by how much you endure, but by how honestly you live. And living honestly meant honoring the work I had done to heal, to rebuild, to choose myself after decades of putting others first. As night settled in and the house grew quiet once more, I felt no urge to replay the past. It had lost its grip on me. The future no longer felt like something I needed to defend or explain. It simply waited, open and peaceful. I turned off the lights, knowing that the strongest revenge had already been achieved, not by taking anything from them, but by finally giving myself the life I had always deserved.